caring about the process matters. Yes, engineers have to be responsible for some aspects of how you ship code, thinking about the stuff, but we don't want to overload them with the cognitive burden. And I think that's really the kind of thesis of these first two parts of the book.
Hey there, welcome to Book Overflow. This is the podcast for software engineers by software engineers, where every week we read one of the best technical books in the world in an effort to improve our craft. I'm Carter Morgan, and I'm joined here, as always, by my co-host, Nathan Toups. How are you doing, Nathan?
Doing great. Hey, everybody.
Well, thanks for tuning in, everyone. As always, like, comment, subscribe wherever you're at. Share the podcast with your friends and coworkers on LinkedIn or on Slack. And yeah, keep listening. And we don't have anything specific to announce just yet, but we do have new author interviews working through the pipeline. So stay tuned for those. We're excited to announce those as we come along. And we're excited. We're doing a new book. Moving on to a big one. This is, I don't know, Nathan, would you say, is this a very well-known book, the DevOps Handbook?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a compliment to Unicorn and Phoenix Project. I think it kind of sums up those things. But yeah, it's in the list of people recommend for sure.
Absolutely. This is, we're doing the DevOps Handbook. Like you said, it's very much a compliment to Unicorn Project and Phoenix Project. It's written by, I know, Gene Kim, because it's got 4 authors. We've got Gene Kim, Jez Humble, Patrick Dubois, John Willis, and Nicole Forsgren, who wrote the foreword. What's the overlap of the Phoenix Project there? Is that, I'm looking it up right now. Who wrote that?
These are all heavy hitters in the DevOps community. And of course, that's my background. I think probably even more than you, Carter. So I've read a lot of this material and seen a lot of talks. There's, DevOps days. There's the Accelerate work. Nicole also worked on Dora and Space frameworks, which are really important ways of measuring things. Obviously, Jez Humble and Gene Kim are prolific voices in the community as well. There's a lot of wisdom in this book.
I'm seeing only Gene Kim is the only overlap, at least with the Unicorn Project. But let's go ahead and give quick some background on each of these authors. We've got Gene Kim, is a technology researcher and author who founded IT Revolution, is best known for the Phoenix Project and his work studying high-performing technology organizations. We've got Jez Humble, who's a software engineer, researcher, and co-author of Continuous Delivery, who has worked at companies like Google and currently teaches at UC Berkeley. Patrick Dubois is considered the father of DevOps for organizing the first DevOps Days conference in 2009 and is a consultant who helps organizations with their DevOps transformations. John Willis is a DevOps evangelist, a consultant with over 40 years of IT experience who has worked at Docker, Red Hat, and Chef and co-hosts the DevOps Cafe podcast. And Nicole Forsgren, who is a researcher and expert in DevOps, who led the State of DevOps reports, co-authored Accelerate, and was VP of Research and Strategy at GitHub after her startup Dora was acquired by Google. And then just the introduction for the book, we've got DevOps Handbook is the definitive guide for applying DevOps principles across entire organizations, not just IT departments, recognizing that technology is now core to every business. The second edition adds 15 new case studies from organizations like Adidas, American Airlines, and the U.S. Air Force, plus new research and insights from Dr. Nicole Forsgren. With over 100 pages of new content, it provides tools and practices for anyone working with technology to create organizational success. So we read the first 2 parts this week. Well, there's 6 parts. So we're going to cover it over 3 weeks. Nathan, give us your thoughts on the first 2 parts of DevOps Handbook.
Yeah, this book is a great sort of more business-centric text. If you don't want to read an allegorical story like the Phoenix Project or the Unicorn Project, and you really kind of want to get all the major plot points in the form of something that's kind of more traditional software engineering, software business type book. So there's a lot of wisdom. There's a lot of really good case studies. This book is also it was right up my alley. I mean, I'm from this world. It's been really cool to see this transformation. I will say I do have some concerns that maybe I think DevOps has a bad habit of overselling what it can do. And I think this book is no exception to it. I mean, every example here is, look, as soon as people apply these principles, everything magically gets better. And I don't think that DevOps can overcome certain organizational problems. And I think that's why books like Team Topologies and other things exist. But I would like to address those concerns as we go through it. I don't want to just like rubber stamp a book, even if especially if it's a book I'm a big fan of. I think if applied correctly, this is really cool. And again, this is like a nice playbook. This is called a DevOps Handbook. And handbook to me feels like it's something I can hold in my hand. And this is more like a huge volume, right? Like this is going to take us several weeks to get through. So yeah.
Yeah. For me, it's we picked up this book because I'm a new company. It's a startup, and so we have some DevOps stuff we want to get done. Like we're not doing CI/CD quite yet. And so I was like, you know what? Like DevOps would be a great thing to look at. This book, it was written in 2016, and I think again suffers a little from like that whole Seinfeld isn't funny thing. Like this was I'm sure very revolutionary at the time. It's been 10 years, and a lot of companies work like this, especially a lot of the bigger companies I've worked at. And then
actually, I think that the second edition came out in the early 2020s, like 2021 or so.
Yeah, but I wonder like how different the first and second edition are from each other. Like they say the 15 new case studies and there's over 100 pages of new content. I guess at least the first third of this book, I'm curious as it goes on, is kind of really trying to sell the idea of DevOps, and in particular sell this idea of like having feature teams instead of functional teams, right? We've talked about in the past the idea that like you should have a team dedicated to a service, and that team should have everything you need on it, like your database. You know, right.
This is one of my criticisms, and I know I've interrupted your initial thoughts.
Go for it.
But this is one of my criticisms of this book. It's incredibly enterprise focused. This is not, at least the first third of this book is not, hey, you're a startup. You want to do things right from day one. Here's how you transition from being scrappy founder code into awesome production. This is like American Airlines had a 8-month deployment cycle, and now they're down to multiple deploys per day. And here's how they did it with their multi-million-dollar budget. And you're like, that doesn't help me at all when I'm a Y Combinator startup. Like this isn't, I think that's one critique is like, this feels like a consulting descendant of the Agile Manifesto consulting groups, right? Like, I'm sure that Gene Kim and some of these other folks have probably gotten some pretty sweet Fortune 500 consulting gigs out of this, where really smart engineers who maybe have taken the wrong approach have come in and completely revolutionized how they ship so that they could be competitive. And if you think about this with Phoenix Project and Unicorn Project, it's on brand, right? The whole point of that was this old automobile parts manufacturing company becoming relevant, and that everybody's really a tech company and all these other things. But if you're a scrappy startup and you're like, okay, wait, I don't want to be those guys. I want to be David, not Goliath. How do I do this from day one? This isn't that.
I had that same thought too, where like there's so many like it's saying great things. Like and if you've worked at a big company, again, kind of like a classic Phoenix Project or Unicorn Project type company, like there's a lot of value, at least in the first third of this book. But it's trying to sell me on this idea of like, this is why you shouldn't have a separate database administration team and a separate, whatever server provisioning team or and this idea of like feature teams, not functional teams. And I'm kind of like, so at my company we have 8 engineers, right? Like we couldn't even have those teams if we wanted. And so is it great to know this stuff as the company grows to not fall into these patterns? Absolutely. But I am a little like, it's very, very enterprise focused.
I will say where I do think it would be useful is this is a really good, it's too much for just this use case. I think this could be a blog post, but it's a cautionary tale of not cargo culting process. So like one of the things as your team grows is you might go, oh, wait, well, so-and-so puts all these quality checks, or we need a QA person or these other things. And you're like, you really don't like, this is a good example of why having a separate QA is terrible, right? Why? Because right now you're in a wonderful, this is like the coolest place ever. Your entire engineering organization is a 2 pizza team, right?
Yeah.
Like y'all can have a hackathon and feed pizza to the team and like do things and unblock each other and include the CEO and all these things that you can't do in these large organizations, at least not unless you do team topology stuff where you're doing X as a service and enablement and all these other kind of big structural things. Y'all have that. Like you are DevOps if you want to be DevOps. I will say I accidentally read ahead a little bit, and I do think that like starting in part 3, there are going to be more applicable things. So there is silver lining. But yeah, in this early part, it really does seem like you're like trying to convince, kind of a, Eeyore that he should cheer up a little bit, kind of a thing.
Yeah, it's and I'm trying to find the balance at my current place. Like when you work at really big companies, the product is generally considered established in whatever team you join. There's exceptions. Maybe you're joining a new initiative, but at any rate, so if you show up to a project at a really big company, you can kind of look at any place in the code base, and if there's anything that isn't following best practices or sensible defaults or whatever, as Martin Fowler calls them, you can kind of point to that and say, hey, we're not doing that, we should do that. And everyone's going to be like, great, like, yeah, we hadn't gotten to that yet, but that's a great thing for you to focus on, right? I'm trying to be better at a startup. Like, for example, this is a small one, but I noticed like in React, if you're working with GraphQL, I think we're using Apollo as our GraphQL library. But anyway, how it works
pretty
is
common, yeah.
exactly right. You define your GraphQL schema in files within the app, and then you run a CLI command, and that generates the TypeScript hooks for those GraphQL files that you created. And those are it's like file.generated.ts. You're not supposed to commit the generated files. It just kind of clogs up the repo, right? For some reason we are. I don't know why that happened. But I was kind of like, an old me would have been like, oh my gosh, such low hanging fruit. Let's not commit the generated files. Whereas I'm trying to be better at this new company, kind of being like, well, wait a minute. Like, is there a good reason we're committing the generated files? And more importantly, is this the highest priority thing we could be working on right now? Right. Like, the company's not profitable yet, right? Like, when the company's not profitable, probably not a really great idea to focus a lot of your time on making sure the generated files don't get committed.
So I love this. This is a good conversation. I think this is a good non sequitur before we get into some of the more of the stuff here, because these are the kind of problems that you need to think through. I've been in organizations in which we do commit generated files, and I've been in organizations where we never commit generated files. They both can be okay. It depends on, for instance, like where it's common to commit generated files are like, let's say you're using protobuf. And you have the protobuf manifests or the protobuf descriptions, and then I need to generate the Go or Rust or TypeScript or these type of things. I want those because I won't have the type signatures if I don't have them, and it's nice to have that, and they don't change very often. So when the generated stuff does happen, and we can also put in our CI/CD that it tries to generate it, and if there's a diff in the generated versus what's committed, you stop the CI process, meaning that's kind of like a user generated thing. Same with linters and other stuff, right? You can kind of go in and say, hey, wait a second. When I try to idempotently do everything, I'm seeing something different, and so therefore there's something wrong with this commit. Those little optimizations, I actually do think making space for them, and I think they talk about this in the what do they call it? There's like this process improvement where they say you should carve out on regular intervals time to do things that maybe aren't delivering value to the customer directly, but do it indirectly. And I even though you may not want to, you may decide not to change the generated files, you might make it so that the README explains why the generated files are in the code and why we may address this at some point in the future or something, so that the future next Carter isn't confused, right? They go, oh, they can still assess like, oh, is this a good idea or not? But and that's the part, like, I do think that aspects of this book are applicable in that you can still evaluate, are we maximizing flow? One of the things I like to do in early stage startups, this is like kind of my bag of tricks because, again, this is my background. How quickly can I get local dev up and running? And how similar is local dev to what goes through our CI/CD process? I like those to be equivalent if possible, meaning I can run I like to, very common DevOps thing is to like abuse a makefile as a job runner. Of course, you can use PNPM or something if you've got more native tools, but have something that literally just wraps testing coverage, linter, pretty, doing all the like basic things, and I should be able to run all these on my machine, and those should be the same exact commands that my CI/CD pipeline runs. And what gives me equivalence there is that like I shouldn't have some special local magical Docker container. I should hopefully be using the exact same container for local dev that I'm also going to be deploying, but maybe with some environment variable changes or something, because I want to reduce surprises, right? The closer I can get my dev environment to what's going to end up being in production, the fewer weird quirks that come up. Because what you don't want is at 3 a.m. after a big release, you're trying to reason about something that doesn't exist in your local environment, and it gets back to like it worked for me syndrome.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of little things that you can like play, to kind of learn across the way. And a lot of startups, they haven't figured that process out yet, and so it's a really nice learning experience.
Well, let's take a quick break, and then we're going to get into kind of our discussions about the first third of this book. So we're going to try something a little different for this podcast. Sometimes we kind of go through the chapters and try to give a holistic view of the book. To be honest, with this book, there's a lot of excellent case studies, and the book is worth it for those case studies alone. We've also talked about a lot of these themes before, again, because we covered the Unicorn Project, which Gene Kim also wrote. So, we've chapter 1 is agile continuous delivery into 3 ways. Then they talk about the different ways. The first way, the principle of flow. Then we got the principles of feedback, the principles of continual learning. Mm-hmm. We've covered a lot of this before. And like you said, Nathan, you've got some concerns about maybe the way this book sells itself. So we're going to kind of tackle the podcast from that route. Maybe some of the concerns we have about this book. And with that, we'll be able to talk about all the great stuff this book has, but also, our experiences and things like that. So Nathan, I don't know. So we read the first third of the DevOps Handbook. I mean, what's some concerns you have about it?
Yeah, and I'll do some framing here, right? Which is that there's this classic story of ops and dev, and I think they even mentioned that a lot of folks who worked in this world where you were doing rack and stack servers and provisioning resources, we basically had these vertical teams, right? You'd have the storage allocation and security team, and they'd be separate, and you get these really crazy processes as your team grew, and you had hundreds of engineers, and it didn't scale. And a new breed of company came out, like Google, who really kind of, in Amazon, who flipped these ideas on their head and said, hey, how do we make more autonomous teams who can move faster, and we can really trust our processes to do these things? And so they started bringing the development cycles into the ops process. That's the whole point of DevOps. And so, of course, the thesis of this book is, hey, we've learned a lot of this stuff. We have all this data now. These ideas started coming out in the early 2000s, but they're really crystallized and solidified by 2015. And now they're considered obvious by 2025, right? I think even if you choose not to do some of the things in this book, you're deciding to react against the standard knowledge of DevOps. You're not being like, what? I didn't know that you could do continuous delivery. It's really more like, we chose not to use Kubernetes in this workflow because we're a startup and that's too much overhead, right? Mm-hmm. And you go, cool. Well, and that is a hot take that's been coming up more and more. I think if you've ever seen like DHH and other folks who do like these bootstrap type companies that aren't trying to do infinite growth, they don't want to use cloud and experimentation platforms and all these other things. And so I guess my first criticism or critique is this book is incredibly enterprise centric.
Yes.
And so therefore the audience is relatively small. Deep pockets. Obviously, enterprises can spend 100K, 200K, 300K on consultants to come in and help fix processes. But there's not a single case study of, we had this idea, we had two founders, we needed to hire a team of 15 people, and here's how we used these methodologies to go from founder code into, two pizza teams without stepping on each other's toes. I wish that existed in this book, but it doesn't.
Yeah, the other thing with this being so enterprise centric is this is really focused towards enterprise leadership, I would say.
Yeah.
Right? Like, because when I was selecting a new company, that what was really important to me was just, especially a startup, was having like absolute trust in the senior leadership. I've, again, I
Right.
worked at an awful little startup a couple of years back, and that was the biggest problem. Is I was just like, oh my gosh, the CTO and to some extent the CEO, I just don't trust them. And that was a really hard lesson. And like, you can't manage up. Like, it's a really tough thing to come into work every day and to be trying to convince senior leadership like this is what we're supposed to do. And so on the one hand, like they're talking about kind of like all these kind of enterprise businesses, but I think this would be like, if you read this book, you'd be like burdened with a knowledge if you were like a rank and file dev worker. I don't know. I mean, because you've kind of mostly, I guess that is a gap in our
I've
collective experience.
Yeah, and I've been in this situation multiple times where
Yeah.
I've and I will say this is the other one of the other critiques is that, you know, I wrote down DevOps as a silver bullet. So this idea that if I just come to the table with these DevOps ideas, I will revolutionize stuff. And the thing is that, first of all, if you just read this book and then you try to convince senior leadership this is the right way to do it and you misimplement it, you're going
Hmm.
to give DevOps a bad rep, right? They're going to go, we tried this. It was overly complicated. This feels like Agile 2.0. We already don't want to do this. Like I feel like, and I've seen this in organizations where it's almost great, like it's almost awesome, but it's not quite there. And I think a lot of frustration that exists right now with these sort of like smaller to medium sized companies that have invested in DevOps is that they've invested in something that's it itself becomes overly complicated. And then there's a lot of tech debt, and then there's a lot of resentment. And you get back into this old dev versus ops, situation, but now you have this very expensive DevOps team versus what you probably had before.
Yeah. It's, I, I think it's, yeah, I'm just trying to think about that again, like that process of like managing up, and like I hate it so much. Like, uh, and so with this book, if there's a criticism, like again, this really seems like it's geared towards decision makers and not, we've read a
Right.
lot of books before, like for example a philosophy of software design, that is not geared towards decision makers. That's just a great book for you as an individual engineer to read, and you can implement those patterns in your code base, and then you can become a leader in the code base, amongst your team, just because there's a management isn't going to be in the weeds of every line of code you write. But this is really advocating for some big changes, right? This is advocating for, like, again, if you're working on a lot of functional team, if you're working in a place with a lot of functional teams, like to really implement DevOps, you've got to kind of blow up those functional teams and rebuild them all as feature teams. How are you going to do that as an individual contributor? Like, you just can't.
Right.
I'd be really curious at the breakdown of our audience of individual contributors to managers. I imagine we're mostly individual contributors, but who knows?
Right. Well, and statistically, right,
Of course.
most businesses are small business, right? So while this is an interesting, this does solve a very interesting problem for, long-lived, profitable, large engineering organizations, and not discounting that. Um, we definitely, we definitely have to like think about the fact that it's a relatively small audience for this. Yeah, it's like engineering leadership and people who've had some false starts, I guess, in the past with how they're actually effective. This gets me to my next concern, which is what I'm going to call survivorship bias. And what I mean by this is that all the case studies are they're kind of like Phoenix Project and Unicorn Project, and I get it. But all of the case studies are like, oh, we were having this problem, we did this DevOps principle, everything was amazing afterwards, right? There wasn't I would wish that there was case studies in which we tried this thing, it was an epic failure because our organization wasn't set up to support it, or we tried 5 things, 3 of them didn't work for our company, 2 of them worked great, and at least we still got improvements, but we wasted a bunch of money over 6 months trying to figure out which ones would stick. That feels a lot more like a case study where be like, oh yeah, I've struggled with that too. That would be really interesting. I wonder how we could overcome that. But instead, it's almost like apocryphal stories about how DevOps always fixes every problem, and I'm like, okay, this seems to undermine credibility in my opinion.
Well, and I'll give credit where credit's due. Like a lot of these case studies, like take place over like 2 or 3 years.
Yeah,
Right.
right.
Which, and again,
startups can't do that.
Exactly. Like I got a great initiative, guys. It's going to take 2 years to implement. And granted, it wouldn't take a startup as long to implement because they can move a little quicker. But again, I think just kind of coming back to that idea of it's really, really enterprise focused. I guess here's a question I have for you. The Andon core philosophy, that is for listeners who are not familiar, it comes from the Toyota production system, and it's that idea that anyone in the factory, there's a cord you can pull, and if you pull it, that stops production on the factory. The idea being that the sooner you encounter an issue and stop it, the sooner you can fix it before it gets down the line. That it's by pulling it and stopping everything, all attention can be directed to that issue, and so the entire organization learns from the issue, and that the people who have the most knowledge about when to stop the production process are those closest to the process. And so
Yeah.
That's why anyone has the ability to pull the cord. 2 thoughts about this. One, I believe in this principle. I think it's a smart principle. I cannot imagine what it was like for the first guy. In fact, I was just looking this up, and this is ChatGPT knowledge. So if it's wrong, blame the computer.
If it's wrong, it still sounds great.
Yeah, exactly. Taichi Ono, who's one of the architects of the Toyota production system, is credited, according to ChatGPT, with coming up with the Andon cord. I cannot even imagine pitching this in like the 1950s, right? Like, I got a great idea. We're going to make a cord, and anyone can pull it, and it stops the entire factory when it gets pulled. Like, that's insane. I mean, I think the logic checks out, but I'm so curious how the genesis of that idea, because that is so counterintuitive. But also, there was a case study where in this book where they talk about a team that implemented like an Andon cord system where, if you pull they had like a Slack bot set up where they could type in like Andon, and basically like that stopped what everyone on the team is working on, and everyone would kind of like swarm the problem. That again, like the reason I was thinking like this idea seems insane is because like that idea seems insane to me, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm in office these days, and so the fun thing about working at a startup is that I was thinking like, could we bring up a Slack bot that like talks to a Raspberry Pi that like when you trigger it like it connects like a red flashing light that goes off, and like that could be our Andon cord thing.
That's hilarious.
But I'm just trying to like okay, let's stop every engineer what they're working on. All 8 of us gather around and fix my problem. I don't know. Have you ever worked at a place that does something similar to that?
Yeah. So, you like to talk about your that one little startup that you were in before. I was in one engineering team in which it was the highest functioning engineering team I've ever been on. And I've mentioned it. I was in this fintech company. There was 8 of us total, including an engineering manager, like head of engineering, more of honorary title for a company so small. But he was amazing. It was the most productive group that I've ever been in. And we did actually, this book describes us as a startup, but with these principles. And they were all from larger companies. Folks had been at like Bazaar Voice, which was like a big deal in Austin. I was in Austin, Texas at the time. I've been at some other tech companies that have done really cool DevOps stuff. all of us were software engineers except for me. I was the one SRE on the team. But we all shared these responsibilities. We all could stop the business processes if we had to. And we did a few times. The interesting thing I think about having something, it's like the mutually assured destruction piece, right? Like everyone having the atom bomb prevents the atom bomb from going off, is that you really ask, the fact that I have the power to push the button makes it very rare that I ever do, because I really respect the rest of my team. And if I ever do press the button, it's because it really, really is important. And because I respect my team, I know that I should stop whatever I'm doing. I'm not going to roll my eyes. I'm going to say, hey, you know what? Brian over here, push the button. Like we need to go and sort this out as a mob. And it typically was like, for our case, it might be we can't trade tomorrow because we found some production issue. And I think I can count on half of one hand the number of times we've ever had to hit a button like that. And we had really good postmortems, and we never had that problem again. We never repeated these kind of things. We were able to divvy up tasks to make sure that our processes got more resilient. It's literally what I would, I'm being a little hard on this book, but I actually do believe that like maximizing for flow, limiting the number of open tasks you can have. We were really good. Like I've gotten really bad about it, but I used to be really good at this company of stop, starting, start, finishing. This is like a really big topic that comes up in the first part of this book. And this idea is that like, if you start something and you let it fester, it's blocked, people can't do it, and it sits there for months, the odds of you ever finishing it become very low. And it's this huge burden and cost because like you have this half implemented thing. It probably shows up in some board slide deck. The board, maybe somebody from the board comes around and goes, wait a minute, didn't you say you were working on this feature? Did you ever ship it? And you're like, we got busy with this other thing. We never did it. And their whole point is like optimize towards, and this gets back to agile stuff, optimize towards like having some finishable product on some regular interval, even if it's not feature complete from where you envision it. And make sure that every time you do this as a team, the thing can run, it can go into production. Maybe you hide it behind a feature flag. But that was the big thing for me, is that like, yes, we did have this. It worked on our small team. And we would mob. I can remember a couple of times where we had to mob a problem. It was hard to reason about. It kind of touched on maybe 2 or 3 teams that were, or 2 or 3 services that were hard to think about unless you had the whole group there. And it also helped us learn like, oh, yeah, this is really bad. If you have to reason about service B or service C and you're in service A, we don't have a good contract. And so we were obsessed with what we called our social contracts across services, where you should be able to consume any service without any knowledge of how it worked internally. And you should not hit some red flags, right? Your service should be able to just consume that thing. And you should also know that we're not going to break it for you in the future. This is the only team, regardless of size of institution I've ever been in, that took that blood oath so seriously that, and I've never been at a Google or a Meta or something like that. I think maybe those kind of things are more mature. They probably also have CI processes that would prevent you from doing something like that. But we had a very mature process. We had incredible CI stuff. We would so extreme, and they haven't gotten to this part in the book yet, but like traditionally, a DevOps person would be the person who presses the button to actually do a deploy. I had to build our systems in that any engineer on the team, if it was in the main branch, so we did trunk-based development, any engineer on the team could promote to production unsupervised by me. So everybody had complete autonomy for their services. They could roll out and roll back, do whatever they needed to. And so we had to build tools in a way that everyone could wrap their head around the deploy process, that they owned it. We could do multiple deploys per day without any interruptions. And that's just it's a different mindset of building things, and so that you can empower the engineers so that they can hit the button and say, look, I did this thing, it was supposed to work this way, things broke. Great. What about you? So would you think about doing this at your new startup? Like what would you imagine if you had given this button to your team?
That's what I'm trying to figure out, right? What I want to be careful with. It's funny just because, like, as we've been reading all these books, and I've been taking kind of, chunks of them, little pieces, and applying it to my daily work. But again, I've worked at established places this whole time, and so there hasn't been any really real big drastic improvements that need to be made. But all of a sudden, I'm at this startup, and I can point in any direction and say, "This is a problem. This could be better." Or, there's room for improvement here. Um, but it's all about doing the right things, right? And I want to, like, again, cargo colting. I don't want to cargo colt these things, and so this is one of those things that, like, it just kind of stood out to me as like, oh, wouldn't this be neat? So, like, again, what if I rigged up the Slack bot that, sounded an alarm, a physical alarm in the office? Wouldn't that be fun and very, like, startup-y, right? But I just had to ask myself, I'm like, do you need this? Does the team need this right now? And the thing is, I can't think of why we would need this. Like, again, taking kind of the Andon cord philosophy, which is like, you do this because problems get, it's good to stop a problem now, right? In the here and now, than to let it get further down the line.
Right.
But I just don't think we're really struggling with that right now. Like, it's not, again, there's only 8 of us. Like,
Right.
there's not much of a line to
I,
get down.
I,
We have a good culture of helping individuals, helping each other out. I can't see
yeah.
why we need all 8 of us to stop, right?
Yeah, and again, to me, the Andon cord stuff really comes down to like critical things. Let's say
Yes,
the next
yes.
Log4j comes out, and
Yeah, oh,
you
yeah.
realize that you're in a race against time to get some critical system patched before you know customer data gets exposed. That's an Andon cord situation.
Yes.
If you don't have a mature process that's like 2 lines of YAML and it just patches it and automatically does it. If y'all have to have a little bit of care to make sure that you've really played whack-a-mole all across some infrastructure, which I get, maybe folks don't remember this that much, but Log4j was this very embarrassing exploit that was in the Java runtime, and it could do this horrible shell, like that you could do a reverse shell into production
Yeah, yeah.
machines and pull
It
a
was
bunch of
crazy.
stuff out. And it was like, it actually, when I was in graduate school, we had a lab
Yeah,
virtual
I had that
machine.
same lab too.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So
Yeah.
we had a lab virtual machine that actually had the active exploit in it, and you got to like see it and you're like, oh boy,
Yeah.
this was bad. This was really bad. And so, yeah, those kind of things, obviously security incidences, but there's also like, I had a little one yesterday. We have a brand new greenfield project. I kind of got them set up with something that was really easy to get for like a staging environment, but we don't have alerting and monitoring and a bunch of other stuff. And one of the little services was down. And we realized it was because they'd made some big changes and it wasn't well documented where one of the environment variables got injected into the system. And so it was kind of in this like deploy fail loop. And we, as a group, jumped on together, looked at the logs, scratched our head. We realized we're missing a /v1 in the API path
Ah.
on some environment variable. But the thing was, that environment variable was not set into version control. It was injected into some like secret manager on the deploy
Mm.
platform. And so it wasn't easy to reason about. And so like that opened up a couple of tickets. Like number one, we're gonna have basic up-down alerting. And number two, not like environment variables that don't have like passwords in them really should be in version control, right? Those are 2 learnings that we had from this new team. Well, those are very minor changes, but in the future, this will prevent an entire category of how did this happen problem. And I think that's one of this like continuous learning, and also gave me an opportunity to do a basic DevOps methodology to a software engineer who's super smart, but has not spent as much time thinking about deploy cycles. Because again, I've set them up so that it's trunk-based development, right? So as soon as they approve a PR, it goes into the main branch. It automatically updates the staging environment, right? Really cool because they get instant feedback on any peer-reviewed code. They get to start thinking about CI/CD. It's as close to production. We try to have it as close to production as possible. And we're doing this with a team that's like 5 engineers, 4
Yeah,
engineers, something
yeah.
like that, right?
Where is your product? Is it very customer facing?
So this one is, so it's funny, is I'm working at this blockchain startup. We are always trying to experiment with ways that we can use consumer applications for blockchain. And so
Mm-hmm.
this is actually like a social media experiment, kind of like a Twitter clone, but using some of the blockchain technology. And so this team is building a user, like a what they call, and this is going to sound obnoxious, Web3. Web3 is like the world of blockchain stuff. So this is like a Web2 looking interface, but is backed by Web3 technologies. So we try to like, you don't need to become a crypto blockchain expert to use this,
Uh-huh.
but we're doing like, all the state of the machine and all this other stuff are on chain. Um, and so, yeah, it's funny. A lot of the weird stuff I'm doing under the hood elsewhere is like peer-to-peer consensus and, all these other weird things that you do with blockchain. But here it's like a Postgres database, a, JavaScript node application, like very like you would feel very comfortable. You could work on this code base and not know a thing about blockchain. And so, yeah, this is something I could get up and running for them very quickly. Blockchain stuff, you have to be a lot more careful with because a lot of that data is permanent. It's permanently written into the ledger on the chain. And so you have to think about things. But in this one, we're consuming data from the chain, throwing it into a schema in a Postgres database, and then showing that to a basic feed in a social media app. And that's all very familiar things that we've all looked at.
I'm trying to figure out CI/CD. I've done a lot of work. Well, I guess CI/CD on the front end is what I'm trying to figure out right now because, like, one, we don't have a ton of tests at the company, right? And even then, tests are easier on the back end. Not only are unit tests sometimes a little easier on the back end than the front end, but also you can write kind of like end-to-end tests that you can kind of assert your sanity a little more. Like, even if you have no unit tests in your backend application, you can write some end-to-end tests that are just like, okay, do the 5 main APIs work? And so when we deploy, we're just going to validate that those 5 things work end to end. And as long as those do, like, odds are the application's pretty good. The front end is trickier. And like right now, I'm trying to figure out if this is like a good pattern or a bad pattern. We're doing like bug bashes. So like, for example, we had this new feature, the they changed the way that people could set pricing on some of like the comprehensive coaching packages they offer, right? And so that came out, and we decided as a team, like, you know what, let's swarm it. In 2 days, we got it all. I'm going to use quotes here. Done, because we got it all merged into staging, and then we did a bug bash on it. It's like, okay, let's check it out. And we as a team found 50 bugs on it, right? Like,
Yeah.
that doesn't surprise me. Like, we hustled to get it done, but yeah, like, it was 2 days of kind of pretty frantic work. And so what does that look like in a CI/CD world, like a DevOps world? Because like, how you can't test that end to end in every single use case and validate, of course, this works. But then if we just deployed it straight to production,
Right.
we're introducing like all these bugs to the user. I mean, I guess
So
like you feature flagging is maybe the
feature
right answer there.
feature flags one. There are, and again, you have to kind of go down the rabbit hole. There are automated QA frameworks that
Mm-hmm.
give you that sort of end-to-end testing for UI stuff. They typically have it. There's like commercial tools. Like, I don't know if you've heard of Rainforest QA. They're like an interesting
No.
one. There's a few others. That have basically given like QA automation for UI stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also, there's a good number of them that have um, headless browsers that can do a
Yeah,
bunch of
yeah.
rendering and stuff like that. They're a little more cumbersome to set up, but they can be really useful. There's two paths, right? If it takes a long time for these tests to run, you can do it from a regression testing standpoint, or you basically say, I'm going to deploy this into this environment, but it can't be promoted to another environment until it's past all of the heavier testing that takes a longer cycle. We did this at an airline startup I was in. We had a lot of the same exact issues, but a much larger team, where they just didn't have the discipline of doing end-to-end testing, or they would have manual QA. And manual QA they were super smart group, but it was manual, and
Yeah, yeah.
they have run books for stuff, but they would miss things, and stuff would happen, or what's worse is the engineering team would rely on QA. I played this game. If QA finds the problem, we failed as software engineers, right?
Oh yeah.
You really don't want it to get that far down the pipeline. A QA engineer should really find emergent, surprising behaviors that we hadn't thought about testing yet. But yeah, so CI pipelines, to me, there's two parts. There's like the obvious stuff you do in a PR, right? I do a pull request. There's a bunch of, fitness functions that should pass, right? If we're going to get into software architecture stuff, those are obvious ones. And then, and those are unit tests. Of course, I've noticed this. I don't write a ton of UI code, but to write JavaScript in a way that is unit testable is itself a skill.
Yeah.
It's very easy to embed a bunch of logic in your view that you have, which is bad. You obviously, if you can put heavy business logic that has to be correct in a JavaScript library, and all it does is the pure thing, the pure business processes, where I can inject a mock of the database, I can do all these other things, and then I happen to use this as a thing I bring into my view. Now I have this unit testable thing. If I have it in the view, the only way I can test it is end-to-end testing or integration testing or these other things, which is not impossible. And there are some folks who that's the only way they want to test. But I find that unfortunate because I'm like, if I can describe creating a user in a simple function that has no opinion about how the UI works, I should rip that out into its own users library, have a bunch of test coverage, and then I have this test covered thing that I know how it behaves inside of my view. And then any bugs that come out of that for integration testing, it's like UI bugs, right? It's like, oh, we're not displaying the JavaScript that comes out of this properly, or the JSON that comes out of this properly. But, it's tricky, and UI does make things hard. I will say, like, any of us who have been done with API work, it's like, one nice thing about doing API work is we have very mature test frameworks. In the JavaScript world, it's a lot harder. Luckily, there are some really nice React testing frameworks and some other ones, but you have to prioritize it. And I would say what I like to do is what I call like a gateway drug approach, which is like, basically, I will put a stub in my CI process. I'll literally put a test state that's a TBD. And so the test will pass because there's nothing in it. Then I will do like the most obvious and simple tests that I can do, like the thing not compiles, but the some really basic interface, just to get it so that the code coverage tool then shows up, right? And it shows what I call the sad path, where it's like, oh, it's it's only got 20% code coverage or 5% code coverage. Now I have a target. Now I can say, hey, we want to increase code coverage on these hot code paths over this period of time. And it reduces. So one of the things that this book brings up really well is reducing cognitive load, right? And the idea of reducing cognitive load is that if my software engineer wants to solve a problem, but it requires them to understand 5 other business processes or 5 other abstract ideas, they won't do it. And so they'll go, even getting testing set up is horrible. It's going to slow me down. I'm not going to be able to like ship this feature that our CEO cares about. So I'm just not going to do it. Or we'll do it in QA, right? Like that's just the conclusion you'll reach. But if you come in and you say, you know what, our test coverage is going to be awful, but at least I will have it so that you get feedback. And then do a quick little internal demo and says, hey, we have this test coverage tool. Here's how easy it is to write a test. I think we should start actually doing this so that we can add more coverage over time. And that maybe we can make a new rule that says if you write a new function or new class or whatever, it should at least have a test to cover it so that we can extend that over time, right? That gives me like a very like approachable way. And it also gives me a conversation point in my PR to say, hey, as a team, we agreed that we're going to start writing tests for new code. I don't see a test here. So like, go ahead and add a test, and then I'd be happy to. The code looks good, but I would like to see a test to cover it. Right? Looks good to me. Conversation point at that point.
Yeah, I did something similar to that where like we didn't even have any testing framework set up at all, and so I was like, I'm just going to get this set up, right? And I'm going to write kind of like some trivial tests for this feature that doesn't really need them, just so that the next time an engineer says, or if I tell an engineer, hey, you should write some tests, or if they feel like they should write some tests, like it's there and we can at least do it. I like the idea of we need to introduce into the CI/CD process a stub for the testing section, just to and it cannot even run the test at this point, but we'll have it there.
To me, this is like, and this got back to that great engineering team. Make your bed, clean
Yeah.
your room, right?
Yeah.
Like if we put it into, I think actually an industry that actually has a lot to do with us, even though we're not overlapping, is if you're a chef and you're on a team making food at, let's say, an excellent restaurant. If you ever went back to the back of that restaurant, I can tell you it's impeccably clean.
Oh yeah.
Right? A good cooking staff is not only is really good at food prep, they're not only really good at presentation and cooking the food and cleaning. They do all of these things, and they're expected to play their part, right? How the food's stored in the refrigerator, all the process. If you have a busy kitchen at a high functioning restaurant, the team approaches the process of delivering the food to the customer, right? Which is all the customer cares about. The customer wants an amazing dining experience, especially if you go into like a Michelin rated restaurant, right? Amazing dining experience, maybe surprise and delight them, give them a quality of food and a craftsmanship of creating that food. But if you actually look at the high functioning team that deals with the flow of all the orders that are coming in every night, they have all these processes in place. Everything from how they receive the food and approve whether the fish that they're going to pick for that day is meeting their standards, to how they pre-process it and store it. Engineering teams have to do the same thing. You don't get to just be a star chef. You also have to be like, you know what? I need to learn on my culinary skills of how to use a knife, and how do I store these things, and how do I decide this food doesn't meet our standards and we should get rid of it, right? And how do we introduce this to our engineering teams? This is DevOps, right? Caring about the process. This gets us back to the book. Caring about the process matters. Yes, engineers have to be responsible for some aspects of how you ship code, thinking about the stuff, but we don't want to overload them with the cognitive burden. And I think that's really the kind of thesis of these first two parts of the book.
Absolutely. And that takes us to a good wrapping up point. So we have the first two parts. We're going to read the rest of the book over the next couple weeks. But Nathan, what are you going to do differently in your career as a result of having read the first two parts?
I'm so guilty of this, but I know that I should do it, but I need to like put conscious effort into it. I said, institute, stop starting, and start finishing. My team has this right now. Actually, it inspired me this week. I actually wrote a guideline of how we're going to finish 3 projects that we have open, and we're not taking on any new work until we get these to this finish line, and I'm pretty excited about it.
Yeah, mine is similar. We as a team are actually really good about that. Just like keep WIP low, WIP being work in progress. So I want to I have a project right now that I started and then got put on the back burner for these new kind of package pricing updates. But I want to stay good about that. And we're spinning up kind of a new, we're not calling them teams, we're calling them squads. Just we're dividing the team kind of in half. And that's my squad. We have the chance to kind of set some principles for how we operate. And that's one I want to keep consistent. And then who would you recommend this book to?
Yeah, so if you're in a big company and you're struggling, like if you're the same kind of person that would be reading refactoring legacy code, or you're navigating a larger team that has this initiative, and you've heard that there's a DevOps transformation about to go on, this is a must read. Absolutely. If you happen to be in the DevOps world and feel like your organization maybe doesn't define things properly, or there's too much expectations, or you haven't hit the outcomes that you want, it's a great book. I would skip it if you're a startup. I think there's other books you could start with. So
yeah, I would say like if you are a decision maker in an enterprise world and you are finding that your flow is awful, that it's taking a long time from feature conception to feature delivery to deliver something, like, yeah, absolutely. Check out this book. Like this is a huge helper to you. I agree. Startups maybe not targeted for you. But yeah, we'll find out as we continue reading this book what is applicable and what's not applicable. But yeah, as always, find us on Twitter at Book Overflow Pod, me on Twitter at Carter Morgan. Our email is contact@bookoverflow.io, and Nathan's newsletter is functionallyimperative.com. Thanks a lot, everyone. We will see you next week.
See ya.